Tēnā rā tātou katoa, ko James aho. Hi everyone, my name is James and it's just great to be able to communicate to you all again. So welcome to this little talk. We're jumping back into the series on Matthew, and today we're going to find ourselves in Matthew 5 verses 1 through to 12, which is, probably one of the most famous pieces of the Bible. If not the most famous pieces of the Bible, probably almost certainly one of the most famous things that Jesus ever said. So we're going to be looking at the Beatitudes, which is a weird word, Beatitudes. I actually hadn't really thought about that until I started working on this talk for all of us. So Beatitudes comes from the Latin word beatitudo, which means blessed. So it just means blessed. So we could just call it the blessings, and we'd be bang on. And so let me just start. Let me just read through this chunk of scripture that we're going to be looking at, and then we'll spend some time unpacking it together. No mai, haere mai. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. That's it. Pretty straightforward. Blessed are those who mourn and cry a lot. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the peacemakers. Pretty self-explanatory, and yet at the same time it's not. I mean, in some ways we can hear Jesus's words and we can just apply them directly to our lives, but it's also really helpful to try and land Jesus in his first century context to see what he might have been trying to say to the people that first heard him say this, and then ask that question, what does this mean for us? Because I don't know about you, but I don't often use the word meek. I mean, when was the last time you chucked that in an email? I don't go around pronouncing groups of people blessed, and I don't usually say things like blessed are those who cry a lot. So what is going on here? Now, an important thing to understand is that in Jewish culture, especially in the first century, this was a really common way of talking, especially if you were a rabbi. Saying who was blessed was kind of a shorthand, a quick way of talking about the types of people who are tuned into what God is doing in the world, and saying that they were blessed is like a way of talking about the characteristics of those types of people. So when Jewish writers and speakers said who was blessed, they were basically saying these are the types of people who are in tune with God. Like, these are the types of people that God is for and God is with. In some ways, they're saying these are the people who get front row seats to see what God is up to in the world. And this way of talking, it wasn't just something that was happening for rabbis at the time of Jesus, sort of in the first century. It's actually, you'll find this type of language all the way through the Bible. This is a very Jewish way of talking to people. I mean, if you open up your Bible to the Psalms, which our community's been doing over the last few weeks, Psalm 1 starts like this: Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. So the Psalms start with a description of a blessed person as a person who meditates and delights on the law of the Lord. That's a person who God is with and God is for, and they will get front row seats to see what God's up to. They're in tune with God, that type of person. I mean, you see it all the way through the Psalms, but another really big Psalm, actually, Psalm 119, starts like this: Blessed are those whose ways are blameless, who walk according to the law of the Lord. Blessed are those who keep his statutes and seek him with all of their heart. They do no wrong, but they follow his ways. So when Jesus starts talking about these blessings, he's joining the tradition of the biblical authors who would say the types of characteristics that someone had who was blessed. Now, this became really common as the Bible was put together. And then by the time, in that gap between when the Old Testament finishes and the New Testament begins, this way of talking about who was blessed, it continued. So there was this group of people who formed a little community in Qumran, and they did a whole lot of crazy writing, and we know it as the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is a community that were really, really passionate about following the law of the Lord, and they believed that they were the ones who were doing it and no one else was doing it, and that if everyone was more like them, then God's blessing would return. And so they had a whole lot of writings, and you'll let me read some to you. It says here in one of their scrolls, "Blessed is the one with a pure heart who does not slander with his tongue. Blessed are those who cling to the commands of the Torah and who do not cling to perverted paths. Blessed are those who rejoice in wisdom, who do not run in the ways of folly. Blessed are those who search for wisdom with pure hands and who don't pursue her with treacherous hearts. Blessed is the man who has attained wisdom and walks in the law of the Most High." Now, hearing that, you almost feel like you're reading the Bible, and yet this is not from the Bible. This is from a religious Jewish community who were in the tradition of the Bible, trying to fulfill it. Let's just go one step further, partially because I'm a geek and I find this interesting, but also because I think it'll help us. Because all of these different authors from within the Bible and from the period before Jesus, they were all commenting on the type of person, the characteristics of a person who God is with and who God is for. So there was a really famous writer who was about 150-ish years before Jesus, also called Jesus. His name was Yeshua ben Sirah. So Yeshua meaning Jesus, meaning salvation. And he is the author of the book Sirah, which is in the Apocrypha. So I don't want to go into too much detail here, but there's the Old Testament. There's a collection of writings which aren't in the Protestant Bible, but certain communities, Christian, Jewish, Orthodox from around the world, continue to think that they're helpful in some way. So this book is in that selection of books. And it's really interesting because it says this: "I can think of 9 whom I would call blessed, and a 10th my tongue proclaims." This is Yeshua ben Sirah. This is his list of the types of people, the characteristics of people who are, in his view, God is with, God is for. They're in tune with what God's up to. He says this: "A man who can rejoice in his children, a man who lives to see the downfall of his foes. Happy is the man who lives with a sensible wife, and one who does not plough with an ox and ass together. Happy is the one who does not sin with the tongue, and the one who has not served an inferior." At that point, it doesn't sound a whole lot like Jesus, but let's read on. "Happy is the one who finds a friend, and the one who speaks to attentive listeners. How great is the one who finds wisdom, but none is superior to the one who fears the Lord. Fear of the Lord surpasses everything. To whom can we compare the one who has it, who has such reverence for the Lord?" Now, some of that, because of the language of blessed, sounds like the Bible, but if you actually focus on what he's saying, blessed is the one whose children represent him well. Blessed is the one whose wife is sensible. Blessed is the one who's so well off that he doesn't have to make do with an ox and ass together. Blessed is the one who, when he talks, people want to listen. Blessed is the one who doesn't have to serve an inferior. And when you focus in on it, you realize that even though it sounds like the Bible, this guy has become sold out for a cultural view, for a worldview which says that if you can climb the ladder and if you can be at the top, that if you can do that, well, then that's how you know that you're blessed. And to be fair, our culture has a similar set of assumptions. Just below the surface of our Western worldview is the sense that you're blessed if you own a house or have a job or or you can have kids, or your kids are smart, or if they've got a degree, or if you are attractive or talented or born into privilege, or blessed are those who are intelligent or healthy or wealthy and wise. If we're not careful, we can almost think that God is for those people and not really blessing people who don't fit into our category of what success looks like. And I think that's one of the things that Jesus is trying to get at when he joins this tradition of saying what types of people are blessed with the Beatitudes, and what his pronouncement, what his cultural critique, what his subversive message is about who is blessed. Because in so many ways, the worldview that we have about people getting to the top, those are the ones who are blessed. That's actually really similar to the dominant worldview of the religious leaders of Jesus' day. See, the Pharisees were known to believe that if the whole of Israel could just be good enough for one day, if they could just keep the law, then God would rescue them from all of these pagans that kept rolling in and taking over their city. So blessing was something to be earned. It was something that you earned by making it to the top. And when you made it, no matter how you got there, then that was evidence that God was for you and God was with you. And Jesus had a lot of critique to throw at people who bought into that worldview. See, it's no surprise that the same group of people who had climbed to the top and said, we are the blessed ones, were also the people who were deciding who was in and who was out of their religious system. And in the cutthroat Roman-occupied Israel of the day, many, many people were cut out. And not only cut out, like if you were cut out, you were dependent, not on the state, but on anyone who could help you to survive. If you were sick, or if you were crazy, or if you were ritually unclean, or if you were poor, then you were seen to be beneath the religious leaders of Jesus' world, and you were locked out of both God's blessing and what God was doing in the world. And like the Pharisees, who saw blessing as something to be earned, that some people were locked out of because they hadn't earned it, if we're not careful, we can buy into the same worldview. And if we're not really careful, we can actually do the same thing to the Beatitudes. We can make Jesus' blessings things that we have to earn and do and achieve to actually be blessed by God, which would be a big mistake. Here's a great quote from Stanley Horowitz, who is a New Testament scholar. He says this: "Too often, the characteristics of blessings in the Beatitudes have in Christian history been turned into ideas or virtues that we must strive to attain. When we do that, we turn them into formulas that help us gain status or favor with God, which is, of course, precisely the opposite of what Jesus is trying to say. Rather, they are actually descriptions of the kinds of people to whom Jesus first brought the kingdom." See, nowhere does Jesus tell us that we should try to be poor in spirit, that we should do that to achieve blessing, or mourn all the time, or try to get yourself persecuted. Jesus simply announces the great surprise that these people who are not significant or honored in their society are precisely those who receive the honor of being first amongst those called into God's kingdom. The Beatitudes are not a set of things that we need to try and do to be blessed. They're an announcement that people who have the characteristics that have meant they've been locked out of the system of being blessed are subversively and in the upside down world that Jesus is announcing in his kingdom mission. Those types of people, those people are more in tune with God than they could ever have realized. God is with them and God is for them, and they are the first to be invited into what God is doing. Now, it's important to just notice here the types of people that make up the crowd that Jesus is saying this to. So this is what it says in Matthew 5, 1-2. "Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountainside and sat down, and his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them." Now when we see that word disciples, we need to be careful, because for me, disciples, just means the 12 people that followed Jesus around. But at this point, Jesus hasn't even called the 12. He's only called 4 of the disciples that would make up his little crew of 12. So when it says disciples, here it's talking about anyone that is following Jesus and listening to what he has to say. And Matthew tells us in chapter 4 who those people are. It says this in Matthew 4:23. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness among the people. News about him spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, the paralyzed, and he healed them. Large crowds from Galilee, Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across the Jordan followed him. So the crowd is made up of the very people that have been locked out of the religious system of their day. They are the people that can't climb the ladder to earn God's blessing. They are people who have been left out or left behind. They are people who are poor. They haven't been born into privilege. They are the broken, the sick, those who are in pain. They are poor farmers and fishermen from Galilee, and they are intrigued people from the surrounding regions. But Matthew makes a point that the people that he lists in the crowd would have been the people who were by and large excluded from taking part in the religious community of the day. And yet, while Jesus is talking to these hurting, sick, crazy, unemployed, broken, messed up people, he is telling them that because of their experiences, they actually have a head start in the kingdom of God. That God is for them and he is with them, and that in some way they are more in tune and more aware of what God is up to in the world and more in tune with God's heart than the people who claim to be closest to God. Now that might confront us. We might have all sorts of questions about that, but that is consistent with the narrative of the Old Testament. God often uses the younger brother or the smallest brother or David is a great example. He often picks the least likely person to be his channel for blessing into the world, and there's no different when Jesus arrives on the scene and uses these very people who have been deemed insignificant to launch his kingdom mission. So with all of that said, with talking about this tradition of blessing and the types of people who those teachers before Jesus had said were blessed, and how helpful or unhelpful they were, and then the types of people that Jesus was talking to, let's now just dive into the Beatitudes and see what they might be saying. So here is what Jesus said. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So and maybe another way of saying that is, blessed are those who have very little, because they are being invited into the new thing that Jesus is doing first. So here is a simple truth behind this blessing. Those who have much to lose seem to have a hard time working out how to respond to Jesus, but those who have very little to lose, or in other words, those who have pretty much lost everything, seem to find it easier to follow Jesus and be a part of the new upside-down kingdom that he is building. We see this with the fisherman's response in chapters 4, and you contrast that with the rich young ruler who has a lot to lose, and so he walks away from Jesus sadly. I know from my own experience, when I've been right down at the bottom, when I've been in those very low places, when I've felt like I haven't had a whole lot to lose, those have, in lots of situations in my life, been the times that it's been the easiest for me to make big decisions, to faithfully listen to Jesus, and to really reevaluate everything. There's something about having lost everything, or having everything up for grabs, that makes it easier to respond to who Jesus is. Should we go after having those experiences? I don't know. But the truth is that in the midst of that experience, it's easier to step into what Jesus is up to in the world. The second one is, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are those who see how broken our world is. They see the brokenness of our systems and our structures and our governments and our economy. In our healthcare system and our mental health system, and of the human impact on the environment, and they can't help but be overwhelmed by how messed up everything is, and so they mourn deep in their spirit. Why are these people blessed? Because that's how God feels. He looks at what we've done to his creation, his good creation, and he grieves and he longs for it to be put back together. And so you are blessed if you see it, if you refuse to ignore it, and you refuse to distract yourself from it by watching reality TV or scrolling through social media or whatever it is that you do to distract yourself from how broken things are. Or if you refuse to just anesthetize or numb yourself or avoid seeing how broken things are or whatever it is. Instead, you're someone who deeply sees what's going on and you internalize it and you grieve it. And Jesus says you're blessed. Jesus says that you're blessed because in what he is doing in this age and what will happen in the age to come, you will find comfort. The brokenness of the system isn't going to affect us forever. Then he says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. So meek is a weird word. It's probably the most basic translation is unimportant, right? Blessed are those, and this all builds together, who don't really have the resource to make a difference because they're poor, but they see how broken everything is, but they themselves are so unimportant that even if they did have the ability or the resources to do something about how broken everything is, no one would even listen because they're not important. And yet, if that's you, if you feel unimportant, you are blessed because as you see Jesus' kingdom spread, you will be the type of person that Jesus uses to spread it. You will be the one who inherits or you're the beneficiary of what Jesus' kingdom movement is all about because he uses the unimportant. They're invited, they're welcomed, they're not left to the side. Blessed are those who are hungry and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. If you are hungry or if you're thirsty, question, do you have food or water? And the answer is no. And have you chosen to be hungry or thirsty? Well, I mean, if you're fasting, then yes. But in the context that Jesus is speaking, the answer is probably no. So these are people who hunger and thirst, even though they don't want to be hungry or thirsty. They're desperate for righteousness. Now, what is righteousness? The most basic understanding of righteousness is right relationship. So, let's put all that together. Blessed are people who so desperately desire for people to be in right relationship with each other and with God and with creation, because that's what God is desperate for too. Another way of saying this is blessed are those who, when they look at the world, all they see are messed up people and messed up relationships and the damage that those relationships do to families and to people and to children and to creation. And they deeply desire for things to be made right. And Jesus says that they will be filled. And he says that because that's what his mission is all about. It's putting people and their relationships with each other and creation and God back together. It's helping people to live as they were created to live. And that's why their hunger and their thirst will be satiated, because that's what Jesus is all about. Blessed are the merciful. So this is like a real transition in the Beatitudes, in these blessings. The first four are about the broken state of things, and then it moves into how people, in light of that, decide to act in the world. Right. So, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. So let's say you lack the resources to do anything about the brokenness of our systems and our world, and you grieve, and yet you're not important enough to change things, and yet you still see the messed up relationships around you. If that's true, then you are likely to try to be someone who does small acts of mercy. If you're the type of person who, even though you have no power to fix the bigness of the brokenness, and yet you internalize it and grieve it, at the same time, you also don't lose sight of what your neighbor or your colleague is going through. And in some small way, you step in and you do some small act of mercy, which is a little foretaste of what the kingdom that Jesus is bringing is all about. It's an act of care and compassion to someone who is hurting. You are blessed when you do that, because that's very close to God's heart. If you do that, you will receive that. Blessed are the merciful. Then it moves on to say, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the people who don't have an ulterior motive. Blessed are those who what you see is what you get. Blessed are those who aren't playing a game and they aren't making a power move, and their desire isn't to be seen as important. The interesting thing is, if that is the state of your heart, you may end up being important, but it will be a product of being pure in heart, not as a product of their goal or motivation to be seen as significant. So blessed is the one who is pursuing wholeheartedly, following God's call on their lives and becoming more and more the person that God created them to be. Because when we do that, God is close to us and we will see how he is at work in our lives. Blessed are the peacemakers. So if we try and be that type of person if we're trying to be the type of person who is grieved by the messed up relationships and systems around us, and we lay our agenda to the side, then we will often end up trying to reconcile people who have ended up despising each other. And when we step into these types of situations, it is very, very likely that the people that we are trying to help to reconcile, they'll turn on us. And if that happens, you'll need to remember that you're part of God's family, that you are the loved and liked child of God. So blessed are you if you know that reconciliation is one of the highest values of the kingdom. And if you begin to see this vision of relationship, and you begin to see yourself as the type of person who God is with and God is for, then the last two blessings are especially for you. Because blessed are those who are persecuted because of their righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you who are persecuted because you're just trying to do what Jesus invites you into. When you are persecuted for attempting to bring wholeness to the brokenness that's all around us, you're blessed. Those who are persecuted because of their pursuit of right relationship can know deep in their being that they are part of Jesus' kingdom movement. They are part of heaven on earth, even though more often than not, it will end up feeling like hell. You're blessed. And blessed are you when people insult you or persecute you and falsely say all kind of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. I'm sure that most of us have had this experience. You know, you meet someone and you're getting on really well, and then they find out that you're associated with Jesus. And so all of a sudden everything changes, and they're suspicious of your motives, and they assume a whole lot of things about what you may or may not believe. And they may even say cutting or nasty, sarcastic things about you, or about what they think about what you believe to other people. And yet Jesus says that if this happens to you, you are blessed. Because just like the prophets, you're doing your best to be faithful and to faithfully represent God to the world. And if you do that, people will misunderstand what motivates you. So the Beatitudes aren't a set of things that we need to do to be blessed. They are an announcement of the characteristics of people who, when they find themselves feeling sad about the state of the world, or gutted about the brokenness of relationships, or unimportant to do anything about it, or poor and having no resources to look after yourselves, and yet in spite of all of that, they step into small acts of mercy and kindness and are pure in their motivations and seek to reconcile people to each other. Those people are blessed because they are in tune with what God is up to in the world and what Jesus is initiating and bringing to fulfillment in and through the kingdom of God. I want to tie all of this together with one final quote by Dr. Tim Mackey. He says this: Who do you see in these 9 blessings? Can you think of someone who came from poor, insignificant circumstances, who mourned and grieved over the state of the world, and the people that he met, and he was extremely important, but he did not think of himself as important, and he longed to see God's world set right, and so with small acts of mercy to hurting, broken people, he showed his pure devotion to the cause of the kingdom, and he inserted himself into dangerous situations between people who hated each other, and he got persecuted. In fact, he got killed for it. The death of Jesus, who was the perfect embodiment of these blessings, the death of Jesus is not the unfortunate death of Jesus, the social worker. His death is actually the way that he epitomizes the values of the kingdom by setting aside his status and as the representative for all of us, dying in our place as he took into himself the consequences of the screwed up things that we have done to each other and to God's good world. He, in his resurrection from the dead, is Jesus' commitment to the goodness of our world and to redeeming it. And in and through that, he offers us hope and forgiveness and life to those who will trust him in faith. And so, these Beatitudes seem like they're about us at first glance, but ultimately they point towards the person of Jesus, his life, his teachings, his death, his resurrection, and they invite us once again to trust him in faith and to become the people that he created us to be and to be part of his kingdom movement into hearts, habitats, and humanity.